Hey, welcome to ShortCasts with Ryan, and I'm your host. You don't need me or Bill Gates to tell you we're living through crazy times. But I wanted to share some of the biggest lessons that both Bill and myself have learned to help us navigate how we think of everything from the coronavirus to the problem of systematic racism to how we think of first and third world countries. In this podcast miniseries, I'm going to overview some of the biggest lessons I've learned from the New York Times best-selling and my personal favorite book, Factfulness. This book, written by Hans Roslings, called Factfulness, 10 Reasons Why We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think, has absolutely changed my life for the better, as well as being Bill Gates' most gifted book. Bill calls it an indispensable guide to thinking clearly about the world, and I couldn't agree with him more. I'll be breaking down a few of the lessons in this book across a couple episodes to bring you a mental model and a way of thinking that I've adapted and has completely changed how I view reality for the better. The first lesson is called the gap instinct and is one of the big three mega misconceptions outlined in this book. The gap instinct is our common tendency and misconception to group all types of things into two often conflicting groups that usually have a gap in between. For example, we often try to put everything into two groups, right versus wrong, good versus evil, rich versus poor, third world versus first world, Republican versus Democrat, and the list goes on. As you can imagine, almost nothing fits into two perfectly distinct categories that are often pitted against each other. Almost everything actually lies on a spectrum, with the majority of people, ideas, and perspectives lying somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. The best example from the book is people's perspective on first world versus third world countries, where a country is either developed and rich or undeveloped and poor. We tend to use these groups to categorize countries accordingly, but the reality is that the majority of countries are right in the middle, where citizens are moving out of poverty but aren't what Western society would consider wealthy. We can take a look at some of the recent problems we've been experiencing to see how we're doing this even today. For the coronavirus, as an example, we have those who are openers versus closers as it relates to opening up the business and the economy. We have those who wear masks versus those who don't wear masks, the masks versus no masks. For Americans, we have pro-Trump versus anti-Trump supporters. And for systemic inequality, we have people forming arguments and groups of all lives matter versus Black lives matter. It doesn't matter what we talk about or what the nature of the reality of the problem is. We tend to group things into two groups, and often those groups are in opposition. The additional unfortunate thing is that our attention is often drawn by extreme and emotional points of view. This means that those who lie on an extreme of any point will usually capture more attention because of the drama and emotional reaction of their viewpoint, which will naturally pull people towards extremes. It's important to understand that for almost every topic, there is a spectrum instead of groups. And most people and most solutions actually lie in the less dramatic middle and the quiet majority. I challenge you to try to spot both when you and others try to put ideas, objects, arguments, and people into two distinct categories. Try to take a step back and see that these categorizations hurt more than they help, and don't lead to the solutions that are often found in the middle of the spectrum. The second key lesson of factfulness is the negativity instinct. This is our instinct and tendency to notice the bad more than the good. Our tendency to remember and hear about shocking and emotional stories rather than positive or dull truths. This instinct is the driver behind the idea that most people will say they think the world is getting worse, when in reality, our world is getting better by almost every conceivable metric. It is very common for people to stick to the bad news, and part of that problem is both this instinct to grasp onto fear, but also in media's selective reporting. Media outlets know that people are more likely to listen, remember, react, and watch news and entertainment that elicits an emotional response, and negative emotions are often the strongest. If you watch the news, we are used to hearing all the terrible things happening and all the bad stories. What we never hear about or remember is all the good things happening and the progress that takes small micro improvements and incremental steps over time. We never hear about all the airplanes that didn't crash today. We never hear about the millions of people who are escaping poverty around the world every year, and that in 20 years, the number of people living in extreme poverty has been cut in half. We never hear about how life expectancy has increased by 10 years since the 70s, but we sure do hear about deaths, destruction, chaos, and deceit. One thing that we hear again and again is people telling us how we feel versus how we think. We feel that things are worse when they aren't. We feel like there is more death than life. We feel like things are crumbling around us. Too often, people are controlled more by their feelings toward a situation than what they think and what the facts can tell. 2 things to keep in mind for combating this instinct. Expect to hear bad news. Just know that media and bad news will be shown more and draw your attention more. That doesn't mean everything is bad. There's good happening all around. It just typically goes unnoticed. Also remember, things can be bad, but better. If you look at inequality, I would be completely wrong to say things aren't bad. Any level of discrimination is bad, but things are better than they were even 50 years ago. Yes, the world still may be bad, but it's better. And getting better still, one slow, non-newsworthy step at a time. The third lesson I'm going to talk about today is called the Straightline Instinct. This is the idea that we tend to think that how the world is today is how it will always be, and that the rate of change on any subject is the same. This really applies when we look at and try to understand data and graphs. If we look at a graph like world population or CO2 emissions, we often see the end of the graph and imagine a straight line going up at the same rate the graph ended. We will often underestimate how much things can and will change, and that even though we are seeing world population grow at rapid rates, it's not going to grow forever. The rate of change for almost everything is changing, and we tend to forget that things can change and can change at varying rates. One thing you can do to help combat this misconception is by simply being aware that data and the world are always changing. How the world is today and the problems we see today are not always how the world will be. In our lifetimes, we will see change come at varying rates. If you see a graph that looks like it's going to fly off the chart if it continues, know that almost all of these exponential curves we see round off and turn into either S-curves or bell curves. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Real and ShortCasts with Ryan. I hope you enjoyed these lessons brought to you by Factfulness by Hans Roslings. This is the book, and I cannot recommend it enough. You can buy it off Amazon for somewhere between $10 and $15, and I'll throw that link in the description. The book's filled with charts, graphs, visuals, and even questions for you to answer along that you just can't get by listening to a podcast in the audio. So definitely go and check that out. Feel free to subscribe, like, or comment, and wait for the next episode that will have more lessons from Factfulness, or go and check out other podcasts or videos at this point. I wanted to let you know that I just released a website called realwithryan.com, and that's going to be in the description, and it connects all of my podcasts, my YouTube videos, and my different types of media, as well as having some of my story and a way to contact me right there on the website. So check that out. I thank you so much for listening, and make sure to remember not to split things into two separate groups, and that things can be bad but better.